Hey there, welcome to the Game Artist Podcast. My name is Ryan Kingslien. I am the founder of the Game Art Institute, where we train artists for the career of their lives. In this podcast, we interview amazing game artists to see what makes them tick and see how they got where they are today. So sit back, relax. I look forward to sharing their journey with you. All right. Welcome back. Christian, so great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, man. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we start by you telling people what you do? And I almost always do this, but with you in particular, this is going to be a real interesting conversation because you tracked a path I explored early on in my career, but you went deeper. So why don't we start first with what you do now, and then I want to back that up into some of your education and your training because you went pretty deep there.
Right. Nowadays, I have my own company, my own studio in Barcelona.
Uh-huh.
What I'm aiming to do is to hit three different things, which are three things that have kind of always defined me as a student and as an artist and as a professional throughout my career, which is obviously doing visual effects and learning, but also creating. So the idea is that we're consistently creating our own IP. And then the third thing is education, which has been a part of my career since I was good enough to educate, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'm doing pretty much all of the time. I'm still teaching in other places. So I teach at the Barcelona Academy of Art, which is, where I'm still able to tie in traditional teaching there. I teach sculpture and anatomy there.
You do the clay work there?
Clay sculpture and then anatomy lectures. And then I teach écorché for 6 months a year, which is working in clay, but sculpting the figure, just starting from the bones and then the muscles on top of that. And then as and when it's appropriate, I'll still go into London to teach. Last week, I was doing an anatomy workshop for Frame Store. So, trying to balance those two things out.
And then are you doing a lot of freelance on top of that?
No, any freelance work that I'd get, I'd try and run through the company, and nowadays what I'm trying to do is, because I have my own artists to train up, I would rather them do the work and then me supervise and focus on other things.
That's interesting. All right. So you have a team that you work with.
Yeah, we're really small. In my company, we're 5 people, and then we have a small team of outsourcers that any overspill will go to.
That's great. And located in Barcelona, so you're dealing with the EU customers, or are you also doing North America?
Yeah, I was freelance for 5 or 6 years or something. After I left Double Negative, I was freelancing for a long time. And so then I was just building up a client base. So actually my client base is from what I built up then, which is largely London-based customers, indie film producers and things like that. And then a few LA side. Yeah, we actually have no Spanish customers that I can think of. It's just happenstance that we ended up in Barcelona. It was a good place to raise a family. And then there's the academy there, which I had close ties to, and a couple of film schools that I taught at as well.
Now, tell me a little bit about those ties, because you're Atelier trained, I'd say, yeah?
Yeah.
What does that mean to be Atelier trained?
So it means going through the academic system, which is the 19th century way of approaching figurative art, fine art, let's say, because it would cover landscape and still life as well. So in that respect, if you look at the whole history of art, it's a relatively new approach. It's not the same techniques that, for example, Michelangelo would have been using or the ancient Greeks would have been using. It's a very regimented academic approach to studying art, which has enjoyed something of a resurgence in the last 10, 15 years, thanks to the Florence Academy of Art. And then, all of the offshoots that you've seen from that, like spores or something, going around the world. I mean, whether that's artistically your style or not is another thing. But in terms of the kind of work we do, whether it's film, visual effects, games, other forms of entertainment, a large part of what we need to do is to be able to look at something and work from it diligently. You could say copy it, but that's the wrong way of looking at it. But to be able to work to a very, very high level of accuracy, that's where the Atelier method really stands out. It has its downsides because it limits creativity, because students can get trapped in copying. But for a lot of my career, what allowed me to progress was the ability to just look at a thing and make it like the thing. And that's coming from the Atelier way of working.
Yeah, got it. There's an interesting thing that happened to me early in my career. I'm not Atelier trained. I was trained at Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, which then was the New York Graduate School, had come up just a couple of years before I went to PAFA. So it was like the only place I could go to find traditional training. And even then it wasn't traditional. It was just like 3 traditional teachers. That was it. But we had casts. We had casts Napoleon sent. We had a cast of Michelangelo's David. We had a cast of the Laocoon and a couple of other things. It was just beautiful. Anyways, I came to Hollywood to study, and I was in an interview towards the end of my time studying digital stuff. I had an interview with somebody out of DreamWorks, And I was showing him my portfolio, and there was a storyboard thing they were looking at, and I could draw, but storyboarding I just was painful. And so there was this one scene where it's like somebody puts their foot into a puddle, and the guy goes, "Well, you're supposed to, when they put their foot in the puddle, you just put like little make it like splashes of water coming out of the puddle." And in my mind, I'm thinking, "Oh fuck, how do I draw splashes?" I'm gonna have to go get some time lapse reference, and then I'm gonna be copying some splashes. So I just asked him, I'm like, "How do you draw splashes?" And he looked at me like I was an alien, and just like quickly scribbled a couple of like little lines that showed, cartoony lines. And I was like, "Oh my god, I'm such an idiot," And right before this guy's like, "Oh yeah, your drawing's really good," and then afterwards he's like, "Next."
Yeah, I mean, you've pretty much hit the nail on the head there in terms of the trap that's waiting for you, right? If you study things in a certain way. And yeah, like for me, my ability to copy stuff was a useful asset, like I say. But nowadays, when I'm teaching, even teaching in an atelier, I'm trying to teach in a way that allows for, let's say, the storytelling aspects to it. Because that's essentially, I think, what you're talking about, right? It's like when you have the foot splashing in the puddle, it's kind of like you can think about it in terms of, how do I convey this in the most accurate way possible? And that's going to take you down a rabbit hole that will take you quite a long time. And the other way of looking at it, which is especially relevant for storyboards, but it's relevant for everything, is like, well, how do I convey the story of that as efficiently as possible? And so now when I'm teaching anatomy, when I'm teaching figurative art, that's my number one thing that I'm going to. When people would come to my class and think that, okay, here we're going to learn really accurate anatomy because the guy's been teaching it for this many years or whatever. And not at all, right? It's how do we convey the story in the most simplest terms and disregard everything else? And I think whether that's storyboards, whether it's figurative work, whether it's music, poetry, it's all following the same sort of thing. You go, what is the thing that I'm trying to convey? And anything that doesn't allow you to convey that, you just strip it off brutally, with great prejudice. And yeah, I think that's the thing that a lot of us miss out at the start of our journey. Certainly, for sure, I did.
Yeah, and you go in with great intentions. I want to be good. You come out and you're like, well, in the entertainment industry, you got to work fast. So in terms of your clients and the people you work with, are you working with game companies, film companies, ad agencies? What kind of market do you work in?
Yeah, nearly always film. That's my passion. That's what I've chosen to pursue. And when I left Double Negative, it was, well, with a certain sense of reluctance because I was, having a great time there. But I really felt like this process limits the creative spirit to some degree. I think that's the problem that visual effects in general, games, I don't know, it's been so long since I did any games work, but certainly in visual effects, because you end up with these such big sprawling teams and big sprawling shows, it's very, very difficult to carry any creative voice throughout that. And in a sense, it's almost more useful to crush the creative voice of people doing the work because you need the creative voice of the director or the producers or the writer or whoever it is to carry through. So I felt like if I'm serious about being an artist rather than a technician, I want to explore that to the fullest extent that I can. And I also felt like to do something like creature work, which has really been my bread and butter for most of my career, you don't need a huge team to do that. You don't need a huge team to do most of this stuff, to be honest. You just need to go as directly as you can to where you need to be. So I left that with the intention of winning small shows, which is what I was doing, right? I would work on these like no budget indie films, and that would allow me to do the concept and then take that through to the build and then take that through to shots and just explore that and, to have some sort of voice that carries through, which I could have in working in visual effects as a supervisor, but still my voice would be no more than a squeak. And that's okay. I don't mind that. But like, again, you kind of at some point have to make the decision whether or not what is the thing that you want to get most out of the work that you're doing. And for me, if I'm creating, that's all. Or creating and teaching and learning. As long as I can tick all of those boxes, man, I'm happy. So, so yeah, the question was, what was, I don't remember the question, but maybe the answer's in there somewhere. Who knows?
What are you creating? What is art now for you? It's something I've been kind of struggling with at different stages because, when you go into digital, it's such a product focused area. It's almost like being a goldsmith back in the 1400s. It's like, you're not a sculptor, you're making things for rich people.
Yeah. And I think I've made peace with that, to a large extent. So what I am, the extent to which I'm an artist, I guess, is defined by the client. Some of them will want that and will just want you to have as much say as you can bring to the table.
Yeah.
And some of them won't, and everything in between. And I learned really early on. The first character I ever did was for a Sony game called. It was some kind of racing game where you could smash into. I can't remember, but anyway, it was like a fun Mad Max style racing game. And I remember doing the first character that I did for that and just poured everything into it. I was doing that as a freelancer. That was when I was studying in Florence, and I would freelance on the side. And I remember sending it to the client and being like, they're going to be loving this because it's, it's the game stuff, but I'm also putting in everything that I know about sculpture and whatever. And the feedback was, the thing that killed me was the feedback. It wasn't that it pointed out a bunch of things that I got wrong, but it was a bunch of things that I disagreed with. And man, I couldn't sleep. I was just like, how could they do this to this character that I've been working on for so long? Blah, blah, blah. And so that was, it was from that point onwards that I went, wait, this isn't me as an artist. This is me as a technician. And like, as long as I'm learning and creating, then I'm kind of fine with that. But obviously, if I'm choosing my own personal path and if I'm setting up my own company, I wanted to facilitate my ability to create as much as possible. Mm-hmm. So ideally work would be, and most of what we do is someone would come through with a concept and I would either do the concept or supervise one of my guys doing the concept and then build the asset as well. For me, that's the key thing that we miss in visual effects. So much of the time we get delivered a concept and then it's like, well, the guys figuring out how it moves have no contact with the concept artist. So for me, keeping that as one unified flow or something like that from concept through to final shots is pretty vital. So that's the majority of what we do, creature design, concept right the way through. And then also I'm creating educational content when I can. And one of the things that I want to do as a company is be turning around short films and making educational content based off of that. So our first short is now in post-production. And so this little guy down here, you can see this is this is me trying to have my cake and eat it in terms of exploring myself as an artist, because I write a film with my friend who's a writer, and then I do the storyboards, which I work through with another friend who's a storyboard artist. And here I'm going, well, what is a pain for me as a concept artist is a problem that I've had multiple times when I do a concept and then it goes into a special effects studio where they need to do a practical version of the concept. Mm-hmm. And we have no communication. Like the special effects world and the visual effects world are treated as completely separate entities, right? The special effects world is seen as like the old guard who are holding on to this noble but dying art form, and the visual effects guys are the arrogant young guys and whatever. And so there's kind of some resistance on both sides. And as a result, what I find is they consistently would take our concept and then tweak it so that they have ownership of the concept and whatever. And my approach has always been like, wait, I can sculpt and I make creatures. What difference does it make if I'm doing it in clay and silicon or if I'm doing it digitally? So, but of course, that would be quite difficult to convince a client about. So with this film, I deliberately created so this will be a 10-minute short film. I deliberately created something that would be part digital and part practical, right? So that we kind of get the best of both worlds. Because I think as well, from a visual effects point of view, that's what you want, really. Just like whatever makes the thing work, and digital by itself is not enough to have any real heart. So then I set this up so that I could make a puppet and learn about making a functional puppet, because I'd never done it before, but I just figured, well, it must be doable, like I'm not keen on hyper specialization in terms of setting boundaries, even in digital, between like modeling and texturing and rigging, even whatever. I'm just like, look, just create, man, and just learn that skill of creation. That's what I saw the guys doing in the Renaissance, learning painting and architecture and sculpture and all of those things. Just get to the heart of that and then figure out how to apply it to different things. So this is kind of like my way of being an artist in film, because like I say, film is one of my passions. And then at the same time, because I'm always going, okay, I want to learn, create, and educate. How do I do all of those things? At the same time, we'll be creating educational content on doing visual effects for a short. So that would cover prepping a shot for visual effects, would cover doing the creature work and stuff like that. And that's something that we'll release alongside the film. So
that sounds great. Yeah, I've noticed you've ramped up some of the tutorials over there. What is it? Screenclay? I got confused.
Yes, Screenclay is the name of my company. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff here is related to tutorial series that I'll be doing. And that stuff I just, if you go to my website, screenclayfx.com, and go to the educational section of that, that's all there for free, because it's just, this is the kind of stuff that I would want as a student. So it's, if I'm in a position to be able to put that out and to help anyone else out, then great. So this guy, for example, is a study from a Raphael drawing, because I did a series on anatomy from the masters and just like how they were using anatomy, which is...
Oh, I know this drawing. Yeah, absolutely.
I think like the way that these guys would use anatomy is the way that I think is the way that it should be used, which is, I think, somewhat different to the way we would study it in Atelier. So here, for example, this is after Rubens. And when you see how the way Rubens uses anatomy, it's not accurate, man. It's just insane. he'll like take an egg shape, and that's his symbol for tension. And so for something like this, where you have two guys fighting, he's just like throwing eggs all over the place. And, you know, in doing this study, it took me a long time to unlock that natural resistance to just go mad with it, you know. And then, I don't know, it was maybe half an hour before finishing. I probably had a coffee or I was tired or something. And I just went, okay, Jesus, boom, let's go for it, you know. And there you can start to appreciate the power of how he was using anatomy. And even when he was trying to be correct, he generally wasn't, because that knowledge didn't exist at the time. You know, you think of the equichet figures that you can get on your desk, and they're going to be pretty accurate and look beautiful, or all the books you can get. That's relatively new. You know, you go back to Da Vinci, he's having to cut up people to try and figure it out. You go back before then, the information just doesn't exist. So rather than thinking about things from a technical point of view or from a medical point of view, right, they would just go straight to story. And that's, you know, that's coming back to your water drops. It's just like, how do I sell this idea, regardless of the accuracy or whatever?
And you can get, you've got ZBrush open, right?
Yeah.
Can we get up and explore that concept in ZBrush? Because, you know, this is, I think, one of the hardest things for us to understand. And it's trivialized by comments like the Picasso quote, like you have to know anatomy, you have to know before you can forget it and all of that stuff. But what the hell does that really mean, right? It's like, you got to know something before you forget it. Can we get a little bit more clarity in terms of the steps? And I see it with Carlos Fuentes. I don't know if you know Carlos.
Yeah.
I've run a couple of classes with him. And one of the first classes, he actually had people just create beans. And I don't mean human beings. I mean just like a bean. And then your instruction was to put shapes in there and not make muscles. Everybody made muscles, of course. But, you know, that was the instruction. And the goal is how do you get something that has, how do I say it? For him, if I remember correctly, the goal was to just loosen the hold reality has on you so that you have more aesthetic possibilities, right? And I think that's along the lines of what you're talking about.
Yeah, you know, like the first question that I will ask people, I'm just going to bring up a friend of mine who is just like one of the best figurative sculptors alive. I always botch his second name. But
this guy's a friend of yours? Because then I need to come see you and we need to go see him, because his work, he is easily one of the best guys out there right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and so
this is amazing. I love this work.
At the Barcelona Academy now and again.
Yeah.
And so the last time he came to the academy, he taught 2 classes. They were abstract design and composition. You know, he could choose like whatever, right? He could construct whatever he wanted just for the sculpture students. The things that he chose that he thought would be most relevant were abstract design and composition and storytelling. And he doesn't know anatomy, you know, like, I mean, it's like he knows the human body, right? So he was obviously like delicate in talking this through with me when we first met, because he knew I was the anatomy teacher there and he didn't just want to shit on the idea of studying anatomy. But like, I think, you know, we see it in the same way. And his approach is like, look, he wants to look at things. Okay, so he's telling me this story about like, you know, because he was sculpting forever. And as a kid, he was obsessed with ancient Greek sculpture. And one of his teachers said to him, like, look, you're looking at everything through the lens of Greek sculpture, right? Whereas what you should be doing is looking at everything through the lens of nature, right? And then if you look at Greek sculpture in that way, you see how they were pursuing that, right? So that becomes the fundamental source for everything. And
if I can paraphrase there, instead of looking through the lens, you're trying to get closer to reality so you can see the lens. You can see the distortions and the artifice that Greek sculpture had.
Yeah, it's like instead of chasing them, you chase what they chased, right? Yeah, and that's essentially it. They're going to nature and they're going like, I am a human being and I'm going to die and I'm in nature, and what do I make of all of that? And that's fundamentally what art always points to in one way or another, right? So if you end up chasing them, then you're kind of like one step removed from what you should be doing as an artist. So of course, like Jagortz's affinity with the human body here is amazing, but he's making sure that he's approaching it in a way that he is the master and he is in control of it. And his thought is that, well, I hope I'm not putting words into his mouth here, but essentially that anatomy can be a way of restricting you from going to that. And I agree that it can. For me, one of the things I say to my students a lot of the time is like, the worst thing that you can do as an anatomy student is then go on to make anatomical sculptures. You know, because it's like you now know all of these muscles and bones and things like that. So you want to demonstrate to the world that you know them, whereas that's not what nature looks like, right?
Yeah, it's an especially significant issue here, because if you're doing this for a career, like Carlos suffers, you know, he has to deal with issues all the time where his creativity is just shot down.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's usually, I mean, Carlos is Carlos. He's got a particular attitude to these things that probably is part of that. But at the same time, it's like, we're existing in a world that wants a product.
Yeah, that's the thing that I think, like, if you don't make peace with that, then that's probably a very good sign as your strength as an artist, but it's a miserable kind of existence, right? Because, yeah, you're not accepting that ultimately you're delivering a service. So I think for me, that was a very important lesson to learn and to accept. It's still, of course, always painful, but when you have an attachment to something you're doing. But for me, I just like, if I can enjoy the creation side of it. Like, I don't normally watch the films that I work on, they're normally not very good films or whatever. But if I can get as much out of working on them as I possibly can, then that's a win for me. And then I can take that to my own journey, my own studies as an artist. So to kind of loop what we're saying into some kind of practical application of it. So through here, for example, like let's say that I'm going to block in an arm, right, which is what I'm looking to do. One thing that it took me a long time to realize this, and what surprised me was when I realized it, and then I would talk to other artists, they had found the same way in, or they'd come to the similar conclusion, but from a different way in. Jagorts, again, was an example of this, where I was sitting down with him and saying, like, well, it feels like everything ultimately comes down to this balance between order and chaos, right? And when you look at nature, you see that time and time again. And if you want to be able to render something that feels like it exists in the world, whether that's a photoreal human, whether it's an animal that you've made up from imagination, whatever it is, you need to understand that kind of balance, right? So then anytime when I'm looking at something from an anatomical point of view, I'm kind of asking that question. So for example, let's see, are we even proportionally close here? Ish. All right, so let's take a look at the deltoid, for example. Right, there's hopefully a clear practical example of what I'm talking about. So the name deltoid comes from the Greek symbol delta. That gives us something of the pattern that we could expect, right? Because it's a triangular shape. And then we can find more of a pattern, right? We can break it down into like 3 teardrop shapes, something like that. So you see that pattern repeating. And by the way, like if you look at the hips, you can see that same 1, 2, 3 pattern, right? In tensor fasciae latae, the gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, follows the same sort of rules. So these patterns exist, and as human beings, we have a very, very keen eye to spot them. But if you have a pattern without allowing that pattern to break, you're not going to be able to make something feel natural. And that you can learn that through studying the human body. Really, that's for me what you would study the human body for. But you could learn it from a horse, right, or from a leaf or something like that. So in this case, we have these 1, 2, 3 teardrops, and we go, well, where is the variety there? How does the pattern break? As soon as you ask that question, the answers will start to come, with some study. So, the head of the humerus pushes out here, for example, that gives us a roundedness at the front and a flatness on the back, right? So that's one juxtaposition. We have rounded playing off against flat. Or the heads of the muscles are pointing towards the front, or at least the medial and posterior ones, and this anterior one dives underneath there. So that gives you that S curve, and it also breaks the symmetry between the muscles. And then, if you want to get tricky about it, you have the fact that these muscles are kind of braided in the middle. And, you can study this to the nth degree, but ultimately that's the thing that you're going to find in nature. And like, it's just anatomy books tend to focus on just there's this shape and there's that shape. And it's like, well, there is a limit to what you can learn from that. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you go, but you can take this stuff like as deep as you could possibly want to go. And you don't have to do that through anatomy. That's why I use Jagorts as an example. He just uses the human body, right? And that takes him to just like this pure essence of design. For me, I got to that point through anatomy, but it really doesn't matter. So anytime you're approaching your study from nature, find the pattern, find where the pattern breaks. And you look at things through that lens and suddenly, wow, you start to discover how you can make things alive.
Mm-hmm.
So another example here might be the humerus. We would say is 1.5 heads long, something like that, but less maybe. Radius in the ulna, 1 head long, a little bit more maybe, but still what you have is a much longer upper arm bone than the lower arm bones. And there's also a temptation to stick that all on one axis, but we have that carrying angle, right, as the elbow breaks through there. So it's like you have the pattern. You have a collection of long bones connected to each other, but the pattern breaks, right? This upper one is longer than the lower ones. And then when we roll the leg into that, you see the whole pattern of the arm repeated in the leg, but it's flipped. And, like I did, I think if you go to the Barcelona Academy section of the tutorials on my website, I think there is a lecture I gave on taking the arm and mirroring it to get a leg. And it's insane. Like, I just thought I once tried an experiment lecturing the arm and the leg at the same time, because when we crawled out of the sea, they would have done the same thing, right? And then as we stood upright, they adapted to their different functions, and that gives you the idea of form following function.
Yeah, in your example, did the tricep become the hamstrings, or did it become the quads?
The quads, yep. Because you flip it, right? And so then we go, okay, let's take a look at the triceps through here. We have these 3 separate muscle heads. In the quads, we have 4 separate muscles, but they both are attached to a big flat band of tendon, right? So you have that similarity, and then they both attach to a bit of bone that bulges out. In this case, it would be the olecranon of the ulna. In the in the quadriceps is kind of different because they're passing over the patella, but still, the similarity is just like bang right there in the face, but pretty awesome. Only when you start to look for it. And it was a terrible way of teaching, by the way. I don't recommend that you do it because the students were just learning about an arm, and then I was trying to, I think I was going too deep too quickly. But
it's high level. It's high level for sure, but right. Awesome.
But I was having a great time, because for example, I was looking at the humerus, and it has like a curve like that, and it comes forwards. And then you take a look at the femur, man, it's the opposite thing, right? And then it's just coming and curling backwards, and I was just like, Jesus, thing after thing after thing after thing, you're able to find the pattern, and then you're able to find where the pattern breaks. And for me, that's a really exciting way of looking at things. So, you're talking about Carlos Fuente, it's the same kind of idea, right? It's like, for me, the approach of studying anatomy is just like, at some point you let go of anatomy, right? And I think that was our jumping off point here, because you were talking about Picasso going like, well, you learn the thing and then you forget the thing. And I would say, the example of Jagot is, well, you don't need to learn the thing, but if you do learn the thing, then you can see how much there is to get out of it. Maybe another way of looking at it is that Bruce Lee idea of before I studied, a punch was just a punch and a kick was just a kick. And then I started and I realized wow, okay, no, there's a jab, cross, uppercut, hook, all of those things. So a punch was no longer just a punch and a kick was no longer just a kick. And then he understood, and a punch was just a punch and a kick was just a kick again, right? Because it's all just body movement, really. That's the process of learning anything, I guess. But I think it really works in terms of, studying how to create a thing.
So along those lines then, one of the biggest problems people have sculpting any sense of anatomy or form is the forearm, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we apply that so that people can see that, look, you don't really need to know the extensor carpi radialis brevis, or you learn about the, the ulnaris, or, the flexor carpi ulnaris, or the FCR, or the ELRB, or whatever, because right. You go into all these books and you go into Goldfinger and it's like, here, this is the ECRB. You're like, the EC, that's the, it's an extensor. Yeah. And, from there.
Right. So, of course, a good teacher, and I know that you'll do it in this way, is you just go, okay, well, look, you can just simplify these and group them together. And that's one way of looking at it. Oh, that's a very sensible way of looking at it. But to loop it into, I guess specifically the way that I'm thinking about things is you just go, okay, well, look, forget knowing any muscle and just know that what you need is some kind of operational ability in the arm, right? So, or in any limb, right? So if you want to bend this arm forward, you need a muscle in front of the arm, because all muscles can do is pull. So it doesn't matter whether it's the biceps, the brachialis, it doesn't matter any name or shape or anything. It's just you need something here and it needs to go to there, right? And the first exercise I give my CJMA anatomy students is to go, I give them some made up bones and just go, I teach them about design and function and go, make some stuff up. Man, I don't want to see humans. I just want you to think about this like you were doing a robot. Man, robots are a good exercise really for practicing your anatomy, because it stops you just copying the form so much. So you can just go, well, I would need to put a piston there and there maybe. So that would work to move that as a hinge. And then, and then to bend it back again, maybe I would have a piston there and there or something like that, and then that would pull it back, right? So the whole movement of the human body is dictated by that. And once you look at things in that way, it kind of becomes easier to figure out. Given that a muscle can only pull, think about all the muscles down your front. If all they can do is pull, they'll pull you towards the front, right? They'll pull your head down or the legs up towards your head, which would form a C curve, right? If all of the muscles down your front activated, you would get that C curve. If all the muscles down your back activated, you would get a C curve in the other way. Your torso would come back, your legs would come back. So then you don't need to know that the hamstrings pull the leg back. Of course they do. They're on the back of the leg. You sculpt whatever you want there, sculpt whatever you want, as long as you're following the rules of like, does it feel like it's made up of muscle, tendon? Is there skin on top? Is there fat on top? If you hit all of those things, it doesn't matter if the muscle's accurate. That's going back to Rubens, to Michelangelo, to guys, well, Michelangelo especially, whose anatomy was pretty ropey, but it doesn't matter. He got straight to the story. So then if we come back to what you're asking with the forearms, it's like, well, if I want to bend the hand, then I need muscles that are starting above the hand and going into the hand. So that's what all the muscles here are doing. The ones at the front are going to pull the hand towards the front. The ones at the back are going to pull it towards the back. Okay, so that gives you your function, right? And so then, especially if you're working with posed characters, or you're working with characters that are moving like you would in visual effects, that allows you to sell the movement of it as well. And you don't like, so back here, let's say we fish out our extensors, right? And that's going to be something like that, right? You'd have extensor digitorum, and then you'd have extensor digiti minimi, extensor carpularis, but who cares, man? So there's 3 muscles, put in 2, put in 5, it doesn't really matter, and you never know in life, as long as you have something that's going into the hand to extend it, right? So that's kind of looking at things from the functional point of view. Well, and we can go further with that, actually. Let's take it one step further and go, well, as something that's evolved from being in trees, flexing is a much more important action for us, right? That's why the flexor mass is big and why the extensor mass is small. It's not nearly so important. Okay, so that covers function pretty well. And then, if we cover aesthetics, we either go, where is the pattern and where does the pattern break, right? We just ask that question. Well, we have one group on the front, one group on the back. That's a pretty good pattern. Where does the pattern break? This one's big, that one's flat. Another pattern that we have is maybe that this more or less follows the line of the forearm. Where does the pattern break? Well, it's not quite following the line of the forearm, right? It's coming from that there, and it's more or less going towards the wrist. So that gives you an oblique angle, right? Which, by the way, the biceps also has, right? So that's coming like that. The tendon of triceps is not following the angle of the humerus. So you get all of these little diversions, all of these little deviations that will only appear to you when you when you call them, right? When you ask to look for them, because otherwise, let's say that I make the biceps run straight down the humerus, something like that, and then I make the triceps tendon follow the humerus directly. It's not the worst thing in the world, but the problem is, if I do this 1,000 times, right, with all the decisions I make on the body, and when you're sculpting a body, you're making hundreds of thousands of decisions in real time, then they're all going to add up to something that's a little bit weaker. And so you go, okay, well, how do I refine that tendency so that I make all the correct decisions? Well, one is that you could memorize everything that gives every muscle and every bone its character, and you'll die trying to do that. Or you can know what questions to ask. You can develop a tool set that's going to allow you to do that, right? And the exciting thing about doing that is that suddenly you're not limited to anatomy, right? So like when I started concept art, that was actually after I was teaching anatomy. But I was like, well, Jesus, it's one and the same, So that's how I would approach these forms. As well, like our ability to spot pattern is pretty powerful. So something that I thought of pretty recently was going, I guess there's a rule of 3s on the arm, right? You have 3 bones through there, and then you have the deltoid that's made up of 3 parts. If you come into the forearm, I'm going to ignore the coracobrachialis. You have 3 muscles that we're interested in, biceps, brachialis, triceps. We get down to here, there's 3 masses that we're interested in, the flexor mass, the extensor mass, and the supinators through there. If we want to look at the thumb muscles, there's 3 of those. And then what have we got left over? There's some muscles that we didn't look at, exactly 3, right? The pronator teres, the anconeus back there, and the coracobrachialis. That's not something I've ever seen in a book, but you can find these patterns, and like I would have a greater propensity to find them than one of my students might, because I've been studying and thinking about it all the time. But as soon as I open this door open to my students and just go, look, there's no rules here, just find stuff that works. Like I steal stuff from them all the time, constantly. Like I remember one student saying, like I was talking about this angle of the biceps here and going, well, look, if we finding the order in the chaos, right? The order is that there are 2 heads to the biceps through here of similar length. The chaos is that it doesn't follow the line of the humerus, and that it goes down lower on the inside than it does on the outside. And the student was like, well, you said that the sternocleidomastoid goes down lower on the inside than the outside, and that the quadriceps does, and the gastrocnemius. And I was like, shit, yes, I did say all of those things, but I never connected them together to come up with a rule, which is that generally muscle mass goes down lower on the inside than the outside. But As soon as you notice it, you can apply it to anything, right? Well, not anything, but the triceps does. Bulges up high there, bulges down low through here. So the thing is as soon as you stop allowing yourself to have rules, then you'll open these doors up. So generally I'll start any class or workshop with why study anatomy, if it's anatomy class, obviously. And then the second thing is like, so people will have whatever answers they have. The second thing is, well, should we study it in a different way to a doctor? And that, there's interesting answers there, but of course my answer is yes, and that is based off of the fact that we can do whatever the hell we want. That's amazing. Whereas a doctor, you want a doctor to be very concentrated on the finite knowledge. You don't want them expressing themselves through the medium of your spleen or whatever, right? So for me, that would be the key difference. So I don't know if that answers your question. Your question was about like approaching that, and
it does.
going a little bit abstract.
That was great.
That's the point.
And I think the note on doctors is actually relevant too, because for plastic surgeons, I'll find plastic surgeons in my classes and different anatomy classes, because that is when they need to express it. One of my friends is a breast reconstruction surgeon out in New York, and we went into ZBrush, and he needed something that would allow him to really explore and sculpt the aesthetic aspect of breasts for women that have had mastectomies, things like that. So.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's pretty interesting. Yes, I guess there is a crossover there.
A little bit. All right, so we've got anatomy here in the arm. We've been looking at the language and the patterns. You said a couple of things that I think are interesting. One, you talked about this idea of order versus chaos. And so it struck me as though every anatomical item has some element of chaos, some element of order. Is that one of the systems that you use?
Yeah, I would say everything in nature has that balance. And that most of us will tend towards order because that's the safe thing, right? That's why when people start out sculpting or drawing or painting, they tend towards parallel lines, vertical lines, horizontal lines, things that you don't see in nature, because that's like architectural. That's a safe zone. Most of us fall into that. Now and again, you get a student that tends towards chaos. I'm trying to figure out what the percentage is. It's like 1 in 40, I think, something like that. Those guys are powerful. They're messy as hell and very difficult to work with in production. But yeah, it's a powerful kind of thing. But yeah, I would say everything in nature has that balance, and that's a good lens to look at things through.
Are you someone who tends towards order or chaos?
Well, yeah, I thrive in chaos, actually. So
Me too.
When I sculpt, I just make a horrible mess, right? And I find stuff in that mess. So yeah. Well, yeah, I kind of have a bit of both, I think. Like as a student, I had a fear. I still do constantly have fear that stops me getting to that. And yeah, if I can break through that and just thrive in the chaos, then I'm happy. Whereas for some students, that's obviously like the absolute opposite of what they would want. So I guess you just have to be sensitive to your own self, right? To your own tendencies and work to those to the maximum extent that you can.
I used to, I still do actually talk to students about the idea of classical versus romantic, or in painting, because I always use the painting example to help explain this. There's Jean-Jacques Louis David, neoclassicism, order all the way down to process, right? There's the cartoon, then there's the line drawing, then there's the tone, and then you throw color on at the very end. Verse, if you go into like, I'm going to murder his name, but if you go into Titian, you can see the period in the beginning part of his life, because that guy lived a long ass time. And in the beginning period, he's very classical. And at the end, he's Baroque, very romantic. He goes straight into broken color. I doubt there's much drawing on there. And that really seems to be these two different ways, either the classical or the Baroque approach.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of drawing a distinction. And yeah, okay, that's something to think about. I wonder whether you could track most artists' journey from like one to the other potentially. Like how people would start off left wing and then move to the right the longer they live. Maybe there's something like that, like I don't know. It could be the older you get, the more you learn to just let loose, and maybe you start to be able to control that chaos because you've lived with it for so long. Like Michelangelo's final sculpture, one of the many that he hasn't finished, the Pietà in Milan. It's like an abstract piece, it's so crazy, it's so loose. And, he was pretty much blind when he's doing it, but you can just see him just letting go of anything that kind of held him back and just going for pure expression.
This is the one with the arm that's separated?
No, that was the Pietà in Florence, that he did that when he was younger, the one where he broke it. The one in Milan is just like, from the side view, it's just like a big C curve. It's barely finished because he didn't get that far in it. And maybe if he had finished, it would have been less abstract. I don't know, but it's a fascinating touchstone.
That is the one I meant, because his arm is kind of pulled away from it slightly.
Right. Yeah.
That's beautiful. So let's walk back into this. Now, what are some of the common mistakes that you see students making in the beginning? I know we've talked a lot about that in terms of, they create order first and stuff like that. But if there's something that specifically for character artists, let's say, if there's somebody who's a character artist, they don't need their anatomy to show off 100%. It doesn't have to be, let's say, as faithful as you might in film. So, what are some of the things that people can make sure that they really lock down to be able to capture, that 80% of the form?
Well, so I would say, and I know this is going to be kind of abstract, but I'll try and loop it into something concrete.
Yeah.
But it's like, have a motivating impulse for every single decision that you make, or at least be aware of it. Because, the thing for all of us, but I especially remember being a student, is you're just going around in circles. You go, one day you're going, right, I'm going to move that there. And then you open up another bit of reference and you move it back. And, when you find yourself on that circular kind of path, it's because you don't know what you want out of it. So you need to have some kind of impulse, right? So like every brushstroke you make, every decision that you make needs to be imbued with that. It's kind of like a poet would not just be putting out random words. Everything is there for a meaning. So as I'm working with this, it's like, well, if I'm choosing to push the reed of the tendons through here, it's because I want to convey tension in the wrist, or it's because the person is very powerful, so those tendons are very taut, or it's because the person is old, so the skin is very thin, things like that. So that means that like I'm consistently in control of it. So even if I have like 3 different, 4 different, 10 different reference images up, maybe I have my Echo reference over there, and then I have someone who looks kind of like the guy that I'm sculpting over here, and then I have an artist that I'm inspired by over here. It's like, well, what unifies all of those? How do you use them in a way that you can control? And I would say just be aware of what it is that you're trying to convey with each brushstroke. And that can be a material thing, like it can be, through here going, okay, well, this is going to be pretty bony through there. So I get out the flatten brush and I make it bony, as opposed to back here where this is going to be loose skin. So it could be something like that, or it could just be like, well, I want the person to feel like really massive, so I need much more muscular mass or whatever. So I think that one of the key things that I see people slipping up on is just not thinking about their work. And then that ties in with another thing, which is not being able to make decisions. And like, I don't know, I feel like as teachers, we often don't talk about that decision-making part of the process enough, or at least I would count myself as doing that. But it's like, just make a decision. With my junior artists, I see them, because I'm conscious that every minute they spend is costing me money on a thing. So I'm just like, I see them dithering, and I'm like, man, just make a decision. I don't care if it's wrong, just do something, because then if it's wrong, you can correct it. Whereas if you haven't done it, you don't know whether it's right or wrong yet. And that will come from fear or ego or a combination of both. Like, you don't want to make the mark, because if you do, there's a chance that it's going to go wrong. So I would say, like, make decisions and tie that in with having a reason for making the decisions. What is the impulse for that, And if you can start to think about things in that way, it's going to get you a lot of the way there, and your work's going to feel less disjointed as a result. To tie it in with like more practical stuff, like if we relate it to anatomy for character artists, let your characters have some skin, like especially if you've studied anatomy, like fat would be something like 30% of the average body or something, and skin covers your whole body if you're lucky. So give room for that, right? Like if you have some understanding of the anatomy, even if you don't, have the courage to let it go, That's a key thing to making things feel realistic. Like if you're too tied in with every single muscle and bit of sinew or whatever, then it's going to take you down an unrealistic path, let's say.
That's great. A couple of questions I want to ask. I want to first ask about your ZBrush setup, if there's anything specific in your digital sculpting world, and if you're ZBrush centric, or if you're exploring Blender or the program which shall not be named. And then I want to get back to anatomy and ask one question there. But with the ZBrush or your digital sculpting world, is it entirely ZBrush?
Yes.
Do you have any setup, like any brushes or anything specific that you 100% rely on?
Well, I only use like 3 or 4 brushes. I'll use standard and inflate and clay tubes and move, snake hook a little bit. But to be honest, like, yeah, I think there are better guys. I think you would be an example of this, of people who can help guide students with that from the start, because like I still have bad habits left over from starting with ZBrush 2 like 13 years ago, whenever that was. And so a lot of the stuff I carry through. So like you'll see me, for example, like, so as a student, I had S as my standard key, and that replaces the little widget that you get there to change the scale, to change the size. So what you'll see is like I'll consistently go up here and lose like a fraction of a second every time I do it. And you think over the years that adds up. So yeah, I'm just not, well, you know, like we said before, I will naturally thrive in chaos. So having a nice orderly setup is not natural to me. So literally, like, I do nothing with the UI. I have my hotkeys for the brushes, and that's it. But I wouldn't say that as like, yeah, you know, I'm just so loose and easygoing that it really doesn't matter to me. I would say as efficient as you can make stuff, the better, you know, why the hell not? And especially like, you know, and that tendency towards making things nice and neat and proper is vital for production. So like my Maya scenes, for example, they'll be messy as hell, but before anyone else sees or touches that file, if I'm passing it on down the line, it's going to be spick and span and cleaned. You know, it's the same similar approach to what I have in my sculpture. So yeah, all ZBrush, but no fancy tricks, just a few hotkeys for my brushes.
Awesome. All right, now back to anatomy, and we've already kind of covered this, but I usually like to ask people like, why anatomy, right? Because for me, sometimes I think anatomy is a trap. But like I said, we've already discussed that to some extent. But in your view, what's the principal use of anatomy, and what's the one thing that you would recommend somebody do if they want to get better at it?
That's an interesting question, the second part to that. So for me, you know, I guess like as we've been talking about, I guess everything I do, Jesus, I know it's going to sound pretentious, but like everything I do is anatomy and everything I do isn't anatomy. And I know that's bullshit, but it's again tying into that idea of like, if you are pursuing that route in the way that I really heartily recommend that you do, then it stops being about anatomy and it just becomes about working with nature and creating stuff from nature. So maybe like I was saying that I'd always start a class with why study anatomy. You know, maybe the question is like, why shouldn't you study anatomy? Because that's going to put a spotlight on, like you say, the traps of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, there are a bunch of reasons why not, right? Because then everything becomes anatomical and it moves you away from nature. Because you look at an equishay figure and you're like, Jesus, that's so alien compared to an actual human. You know, hopefully it is. Like, hopefully you haven't seen skinned humans and things like that. So then it's like what happens is you build up your anatomy knowledge in a separate world, right? You have like this equishay compartment to your head where that's where you study anatomy and you forget to connect it to the real world. So then with the second part of the question is like, what would I recommend that people do? I would recommend studying the body in movement, in motion. I'm creating a course with Proco at the moment, just with this in mind, because I think as certainly as visual effects artists, we have like this real privilege to have to explore the body in motion. So it's like, yeah, maybe, you know, you do your figure in a T pose or whatever, but at some point you're going to have to sculpt some corrective shapes, and at some point you're going to have to shot sculpt it, and you're going to have to do whatever else. So you're going to have to know what happens when the arm bends like that, right? And that's something that generally people aren't doing. They're copying the T-pose things and they're not thinking about that. And so as soon as I have this as a problem, then I have to think about things in a hopefully a more like a useful way. So I have to go, well, what happens when this bends? And how do I tell that story? Well, you know, around the back here, this is where the extension is, right? So, you know, you always have this balance of two forces, and, you know, you can define that how you want. Here, it's simply going to be compression on the front and extension on the back. So, okay, how do you tell the story of extension? Well, when it's running over bone, the bone, you know, is really obvious and really sharp and clear through here. Also, because the bat and the skin isn't getting compressed, you'll generally actually be able to read the muscle more when it's getting stretched out and getting compressed, right? And then through here, you've got to look at the compression, and this is gonna, you know, so for example, here we get skin wrinkles. So, you know, if you think about things in terms of like, well, you should go for your primary forms and then your secondary forms and then your tertiary forms. That's a smart way of looking at things, but it doesn't point you towards a story. So here, the fact that, you know, we might get skin bunching and creasing through there tells me about the story of the compression that we're seeing through there. So I would argue that the bend of that and the sharpness of that gets in my story straight away, right? And then I've got to be thinking about the function of it, right? The biceps will be bulging up here, getting shorter and compressed. Maybe we can start to see some of the tendon poking out or something like that as it's pulling on the muscle. So in this way, you have no option but to think about the actual functionality of it. And that's something that you can't do in drawing and you can't do in clay sculpture or painting or anything. Just take a thing, pose it, and sculpt it. And, like if I got a reel where an artist was showing they could demonstrate that would stick in my mind, rather than just another, well, I guess you don't see reels so much anymore because it's Artstation stuff. But, I think that understanding, demonstrating that you understand functional anatomy, I think is a really, really good exercise. And you can take that through to faces as well, by the way. Like if you've got a beautiful photorealistic face in your portfolio, then amazing. But if you've got that in a range of facial expressions, then people are going to sit up and take notice because it's showing that you understand how that form operates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I heard about that course. When is that coming up?
When we finish it, man.
I've heard stories of how that process works. Marshall's working on something there too.
Yeah. So no, I don't have. Well, actually, my producer probably does have an end date for it, but I can't remember what it is. Hopefully not that long. But I've got a ton more work to do, so I think like it wouldn't be before 6 months' time or something like that.
All right, Christian, man, thank you so much for coming in and for sharing your wisdom and giving us the pointers and working directly in ZBrush. It was a real treat.
Thank you so much for having me, man. It's been a real pleasure. Hopefully, it's been useful to some guys.
Yeah, it's been great. And you're in Barcelona now. I just looked at the tickets. Not that much. So, maybe in April, if you're still around, I'll hit you up.
Yeah, man. Let me know if you're in town. It'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. And good luck in all the stuff. And let me know if I can do anything. But otherwise, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and for giving us this look.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity, man. So, and thank you for everyone who's come and watched. And yeah, anyone interested in anything that I'm talking about, then just
head over to your Artstation, actually. Yeah.
Sorry?
Head over to your Artstation so they can see that again.
Yeah,
Sorry, I usually point people right back to that.
Head over to that. And if you can get in touch with me, I'm normally happy to help. Sometimes it takes me a while, but yeah, it's like, well, I guess Ryan, it's just like having students, helping students is a different thing to creating, and it's just as fulfilling. So, guys, thank you so much for listening, for being here, for your patience, all the rest of it.
All right, take care, everybody.
All right. So I want to thank you so much for being here, for taking the time, and for listening to this podcast. And I want to ask a couple of things from you. Number one, make sure you leave a comment or you rate this on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever it is that you're getting this. That's going to make a big difference in helping us get the word out and get people to know who we are. All right. The other thing is I want to make sure you know where to find us. So you can head over to www.gameartinstitute.com where you can learn about our flagship program, which is the Game Artist Bootcamp. This is designed for those who are really looking to move the needle on their career and really lock in that job. You may have gone to school and learned a bunch, maybe haven't learned a bunch. But at the Game Art Institute, the primary focus we have is the very specific industry skills, the triggers that you really need to hit in that job interview. What are the specific things that they're looking for? That's what we're going to be training you on. We're taking applications right now for environment artists and for character artists. So make sure you head over to www.gameartinstitute.com and apply today. That way we can have that conversation, make sure this is a fit for you, make sure that you're a fit for it, and if everything is perfect, then we will sign you up for that right away and get you into your training and start moving the needle on your career. All right, thank you so much again for being here. Take care, have an amazing day.